preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Writers and scientists have extrapolated a future where man himself, body and mind, will be a designed and manufactured product. But is this really the direction science is taking, or are there lines of research so dangerous that they should not be pursued? Indeed, biology today presents some very grave issues, and the world of science is beginning to search for a code of ethics and a scale of human values to govern its professional responsibilities. This search has been accelerated by the whole question of abortion and the need to define life itself, as witnessed by the Karen Quinlan case. A number of study groups are involved in exploring these profound issues. One of these is the Institute of Science, Ethics, and the Life Sciences, whose director, Dr. Daniel Callahan, is our guest this evening. Dr. Callahan was the founder of the Institute, which is also known as the Hastings Center. He was previously a staff associate at the Population Council and executive editor of Commonweal magazine. He has also served as visiting professor at Brown University, the University of Pennsylvania, Temple University, and the Union Theological Seminary. Dr. Callahan received his PhD in philosophy from Harvard University and is a consultant on medical ethics to the Judicial Council of the American Medical Association. He is the author of 14 books, the most recent being The Tyranny of Survival, published by Macmillan in 1974. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Daniel Callahan.
What I'd like to do is lay before you a whole range of issues, primarily asking more questions than giving answers. I do that partially as a personal characteristic because I think one gets at these issues not really by coming up with answers, but finding even better questions to ask, and that is a form of progress also. But laying before you a whole range of issues which I think have certain characteristics in common, and what I'd like to do is try to bring out some of those characteristics and see if I can get you to focus in on certain critical aspects of what can very roughly be called the biological revolution, and see concerning that revolution where we might go. The general area I want to deal with is that of the advances which have been made primarily in the past few decades in medicine and biology. New powers to control the quantity and quality of life, new powers to control human behavior, powers to control the genetic makeup of human beings, and powers to control the way we finally die. The primary large issue, at least the one which strikes me as most important, is the question of power. How do we use our medical and biological powers? And more specifically, how are we to use those powers when they are not total powers but incomplete powers? For I think that despite all of the enormous strides made in medicine and biology, which have put in the hands of physicians and in the society in which they live enormously ingenious methods of dealing with an awful lot of human, very perennial problems which other societies could not deal with, that despite all of the advances, the power we have is incomplete, and it is likely to remain incomplete for the foreseeable future. To my mind, the problem which most poignantly and beautifully illustrates the limited power of biomedical science is that of the world population problem. That problem is a result not of higher birth rates, but rather of the astounding success of medicine, including sanitation, to control human death rates. It is not that birth rates have risen, but that death rates have dropped. And the net result of the disparity between the drop in death rates and a basic Stability in birth rates is an escalating world population growth. At this point, the world population is likely to double if present trends continue in about 37 years. The success in reducing death rates, primarily through pesticides, antibiotics, and the like, has, however, not been matched by an equal power in reduction of birth rates, particularly in the developing countries of the world. And here I think we see one of the classic paradoxes of modern medicine. We have learned how to extend human lifespan to some considerable degree, how to significantly reduce infant mortality rates, which is one of the main reasons why death rates throughout the world have in past generations been high. We have learned how, in many incredible ways, to keep people alive in a way which was almost would have been unbelievable in earlier generations, and yet here we are saddled with a population problem. If one goes back and said, well, what if one, say, 50, 60 years ago could have asked the question, do we want to reduce death rates, knowing that it may produce a world population problem? I don't think anybody would have said no at that point. I take it that mankind has always wanted to do something about death, surely do something about infant death. And if one had projected ahead the kind of problems we have now, I don't think that would have stopped people for a minute. Nonetheless, here we are in our time saddled with the problem which is very much the result of incredible successes in medicine. I think if we move beyond the population problem, which to my mind is kind of symbolic of the dilemmas of power, but limited power, if we move to the whole problem of procreation, how people have children, when they have children, how often they have children, we see still another paradox. If it's the case in the developing countries of the world that people still do not know how to control the number of children they have, this is surely not the case in the advanced countries, in the advanced industrial countries of the world. The development of modern contraceptives surely has meant that now, for the first time in human history, there is a power on the part of couples, at least those who are aware of contraceptives, to control the number of children they have and the spacing of those children. Families can, even if not always perfectly, have the children they desire and have them roughly when they desire to have them. As we know, that new power has meant that enormous changes are taking place in the parent-child relationship, the relationship between husbands and wives, and the relationship between family and society. We do not as yet know what, in any empirical sense, to expect from all of these changes. Nor, I think, do we know whether they will totally, in the long run, prove beneficial. Nonetheless, that is a power which we now have. If it is the case that people can control the quantity of their children, it is also increasingly the case that they can control the genetic quality of their children. Through the increased possibilities of genetic knowledge, particularly the advent of screening for genetic disease, the use of prenatal diagnosis to detect defective children in utero, many couples will be able to avoid having defective children, or at least have a foreknowledge of the possibility that they will bear defective children if they choose to procreate. At this point, the immediate prospect is for a reduction in the number of genetically defective children, not really for a prospect of any radical changes in the quality of children. But even the possibility of eliminating some genetically defective children is seen as one more enormous stride of medicine. The question, though, is who among us can really know what kind of children we ought to have? And who among us can really speak with any final wisdom on the genetic quality of children? That it may be possible in the distant future, not only for people to avoid having defective children, but also perhaps to have a possibility to have some control over the positive traits of their children, will pose even more difficult problems. The possibility of for couples to select the sex of their children, already a reality in some cases, but certainly to become more widespread in the near future, will give people a kind of control over the quality of their children which was simply not attainable in the past and perhaps not even dreamed of in the past. But again, who among us can really predict or say with any kind of certainty whether we would be happier if we had more girls than boys, or more boys than girls, or some particular combination of both? If we move away from the astonishing power to control the quantity and quality of children, and thus to control the most fundamental process of human procreation itself, to other new medical powers, we see issues no less appalling and difficult. It is now possible through medical technology to shape, manipulate, and modify human behavior through a great range of technologies. Psychosurgery, that is brain surgery for the purposes of controlling human aggression. The use of psychotropic drugs, which can either exhilarate people, depress them, tranquilize them, or what have you. And the use of psychotherapeutic and psychological means of controlling behavior, means which can be used in a great variety of settings, which can and in fact are used in a great variety of settings, schools, prisons, mental institutions, and the like. The essence of all of these powers is that of bypassing free choice, of finding ways to get people to behave which were not otherwise possible when the only means available were those of rational persuasion on the one hand, or direct physical coercion and punishment on the other hand. The fact that we can, with increasing precision, produce almost any desired emotional state, the fact that we can manipulate memory and to some extent rational power, all mean that an enormous amount of power is now being placed in the hands first of the medical and scientific professions, but eventually and derivatively in the hands of society as well. Yet, once again, it is by no means the case that this power is complete. People can and do refuse to make use of the new technologies. Courts often intervene to stop their use. And in any case, there are serious reservations within the medical profession, which at the moment has the most control over these technologies, about the circumstances under which the power to modify human behavior and emotion should be employed at all. Moreover, it is difficult, not only in theory but also in practice, to modify human behavior and emotion without paying a certain price. Psychosurgery, perhaps the most dramatic of all means of behavior modification, is by no means a well-developed surgical technique. We do not really know what the long-term effects of psychosurgery are, nor do we have any clear idea of the conditions under which it ought appropriately to be used. While there is considerably more knowledge of psychotropic drugs, again, they have not been developed to a point where they can achieve exactly the results intended without the possibility of some hazardous side effects. One of the most interesting and disturbing piece of scientific evidence recently is that there are some long-term organic brain damage done by an extended use of many psychotropic drugs. Once again, we have power to do some things, but limited power only. And of course, limited knowledge to go with that limited power. Now, if we move finally to the end of life, to the control of human death, we see a situation no less full of paradoxes and limitations. It is now possible to extend the lifespan of at least some individuals, in some instances by the use of organ transplants or by other surgical and drug means. It is possible to keep people alive artificially in heart-lung machines, as we've clearly seen in the case of Callahan and Quinlan, at least to keep respiration going and blood circulating through the body. It is possible through radical therapies, whether surgical or involving the use of drugs, to keep cancer and heart victims going in a way that was simply not imaginable even a few decades ago. Man has by no means conquered death, but we're getting increasingly clever about keeping death at bay, sometimes only for a few days, but sometimes for months and years as well. And yet, obviously, we've not been able to conquer death entirely. Our power to control the condition of human death is still a very limited power, and precisely because of the fact of the limited power, we have on our hands ethical dilemmas of a kind which other generations simply did not have to face. Under what circumstances and conditions ought people's lives to be extended artificially? To what extent do we want to continue treatment? When such continuation of treatment may result in a life which is simply a misery to the person whose life we have saved? If people could be kept alive indefinitely, if people could be kept alive without aging, then we would have total power. But we do not have that kind of power. We are not likely in the foreseeable future to get it. Perhaps, and most likely, we will never get it. Well, then what are we to do with the power we do have? I think all of the issues I've touched upon so far are, in the nature of the case, extremely difficult. Clearly, our society does not agree on how they should be responded to, nor is there by any means total agreement within the scientific and medical community about how at least they would deal with them. It is, moreover, very difficult to see how we ought to go about thinking through these issues. No doubt, trends and rough systems of value will develop. Problems do, in fact, get solved on a kind of crude day-to-day basis. But I think the central issue is to see if we can find our way through the problem of the use of limited power and to come to some individual and social solutions which do justice both to the dignity of individuals and yet allow society to function in some reasonably harmonious and wise fashion. There are a number of large issues raised by all of the powers I've touched upon, and I hardly exhausted the list of the specific issues, but nonetheless, it seems to me that some of the large issues are worth contemplating. I think the first range of large issues can be summed up by the following question. Are traditional values and ethical principles still adequate? By traditional values and ethical principles, I mean essentially those which have come out of the Judeo-Christian tradition as well as the tradition of Western philosophical ethics. They have all been traditions which have stressed individual rights and human dignity, the sanctity of life, the necessity to protect life, and the need to care for people in times of illness and distress. Of course, there have been enormous difficulties throughout the ages in understanding these values, and clearly many disputes and differences are evident. And clearly also there have been enormous difficulties in trying to live up to the implications of those values. For all of that, at least I would want to argue, they provide us with some broad guidelines which have led our culture in one direction rather than another. There are guidelines which have led to a natural abhorrence of totalitarianism, of cruelty toward human beings, the destruction and disposal of the weak, the aged and the ill, and values which have led us, at least in theory, to take all human life seriously. But do the new powers of biomedicine mean that we must rethink those values? My own view is that the traditional values still serve us quite adequately. The more difficult question is how we are to interpret some of them in the light of the new problems. How, for instance, are we to seek through medicine to protect human life and to minister to people in their illness, while at the same time not extending their lifespan beyond all sense and reason, simply because it is technologically possible for us to do so? How are we to deal with the problem of termination of treatment of a dying patient at a time when it's very difficult to know what we mean by quality of life, indeed what we mean by life itself? If we can, to a great extent, control and modify human behavior, under what circumstances ought that to be done? How are we to protect individual rights in the process? And when we speak of protecting individual rights, how are we to deal with the question of the relationship between the rights of the community at large and those of particular individuals in that community? I take it that the Western religious community, Jewish and Christian, has always been ambivalent about the question of birth and procreation. On the one hand, recognizing that it is by no means a blessing that defective children be born, and yet on the other, hesitating, indeed very strenuously hesitating, to define certain classes of human beings out of the human community, simply because they were born with mental or physical defects? How are we to keep alive something which it took centuries for our culture to develop, namely a willingness to care for the defective, while at the same time making use of new scientific powers to avoid the birth of future defectives? Will there not be a tension between our desire to cherish and care for those who are defective, while at the same time desiring that fewer defectives be born? Can we have it both ways? A second large area of issues comes down to issues which may seem trivial or abstract, but which I believe are critical. I'm thinking here of the problem of the way we define some basic terms. What, for instance, do we want to mean nowadays by death? Do we mean the death of the brain, the death of the heart, or the death of all organ and tissue systems simultaneously? At one time, there was no problem about this. People just died, and it didn't much matter whether it was their brains or their heart one was talking about. One could not discern the difference. Now, however, because people can be sustained artificially on machines, sustained perhaps indefinitely in some cases, will we not be forced to be more precise about what we mean by death? And if we are going to talk about the meaning of death, we are inevitably forced to talk about the meaning of human life. And obviously, when we begin talking about the meaning of human life, we are easily led, if not driven, into the debate over abortion, and the discussion perhaps not as dynamic or as heated at present, but the question of the extent to which we should in our society or even in our families indefinitely continue treatment for the aged and senile. The phrase quality of life is thrown around with great abandon these days. Is there anything to that notion, or is it simply a seductive phrase which will lead us to the elimination of the unfit and the desirable? What does it mean to respect the dignity of individuals? Does that respect mean that people should have total control over their own life and death, the right to take any drug they want, or the right to tell a physician to quietly put them out of their misery, or the right of a woman to have an abortion regardless of circumstances? Even more broadly, we're going to be forced by these new issues to cope anew with the meaning of such old concepts as health and illness. The World Health Organization in the late 40s defined health to include not only physical well-being, but mental and, even more so, social well-being. But what could we possibly mean when we say that health should involve social well-being? If we take that kind of definition seriously, we're really saying that all human problems, perhaps physical, political, cultural, spiritual, come down to problems of health. But does that make any real sense? Or have we not stretched the meaning of health to the point of sheer meaninglessness? A very practical aspect of the way we go about defining health and illness will bear on the problem of the way we decide to use medical technology in this or that specific case. Are we to say that violently aggressive people, those who pose a danger to society, are always sick, and thus to be subjected to medical powers to manipulate or modify their behavior? If some people desire to choose the sex of their children, are we to define that as a health problem or as some other kind of issue? Is the desire for abortion on the part of a woman a desire which can only safely be fulfilled by a physician to be considered a health problem because of the involvement of a physician in the necessary technology? More broadly, are all problems which the medical profession now deals with to be considered problems of health? As a practical matter, and a very real practical matter, I might add, in Congress, any national health insurance plan will have to decide just what states of human life and what forms of behavior are to be considered matters of health and to be cared for with government funds. This is a key political issue, but one which takes us down, I think, to the very depth of our thinking about some fundamental concepts. Another range of large issues raised by the new powers is that of the problems of decision-making. In earlier times, when medicine could do very little for human beings, there were no decisions basically to be made. Nature simply took its course. Now, however, people have to make a choice about whether or not to use the new powers, and if they are to be used, to what extent they should be used. How are we to go about allocating power and responsibility for those decisions. It is very simple and easy to say that all choices should be left to the individual, but clearly that is not, in many cases, a feasible social solution. We surely are not likely to leave the question of the use of powerful techniques of brain surgery for the modification of human aggressiveness strictly up to the decision-making powers of neurosurgeons. And yet, on the other hand, when it comes to the question of abortion, the Supreme Court has left that decision solely in the hands of individual women. Do we have any kind of general theory, or are we moving in the direction of a general theory concerning whether individuals should make decisions, and if so, which ones, or whether society as a large has a responsibility to make the decisions, and if so, which ones in that case? My own impression is that we have no theory, but we willy-nilly move behind saying, on the one hand, society should choose, and on the other, it should be left up to individual conscience. My own feeling is that when one deals with the powers of biomedical technology, that this is a very unhappy and confusing situation, one which will have to be worked at in a very general way. Let me concentrate a bit on the problem of decision-making. I don't think decision-making and the locus and source of power and authority is by any means the basic ethical questions. In a society like ours, it's often very tempting to think that the really deep and difficult ethical question, the only one of importance, is who should make the decision. It seems to me the important question is, what is the nature of the ethical decision to be made? Unless one works that out in advance, the question of who should make the decision seems to me entirely secondary and derivative. Let me raise 4 major questions about decision-making in the light of new biomedical technology and power. The first question I want to raise is whether and to what extent the new knowledge we have, as well as the new power, though limited, should be made mandatory. Or if not mandatory in all cases, in which cases? For instance, it is now possible to screen people either as children or before marriage, or perhaps when they are pregnant, to determine the possibility of their bearing a defective child. Should people be forced to have the knowledge that they may bear a defective child? Or should they be free to remain ignorant of such knowledge? Should they be simply urged and cajoled to be screened to see if that's a possibility, or should they be forced by law to have such knowledge? Knowledge, it has correctly been said, is power. But do we want knowledge imposed on people in all cases? Or should there be circumstances under which people might be quite free to say that they don't want to know and they're willing to live with the consequences? Our society does not, in general, allow people to remain totally ignorant, as witnessed our mandatory laws in the education of children. Moreover, society might say, not an implausible case, that it's simply irresponsible for people to deliberately remain ignorant about the fact whether they may bear a defective child. Since society may, as much as the individual parents, have to support any defective children who are born. But what rights do we want to give society in a case like that? Rights which would override individual values and desires, however irrational we may consider them? Is the right to remain ignorant an absolute right? Is the requirement a kind of moral duty that we should gain knowledge an absolute moral duty, or are there other considerations which should override it? If we think that the state does have the state, or let me say more broadly, the society does have some stake in whether or not defective children are born, are we then prepared to give the state, to go carry things one step further, the power to force people to act upon the knowledge which we may have forced upon them? In short, if somebody is forced to go through an examination to determine if they are likely to bear a defective child, are we also to force them, say, to have an abortion to get rid of that defective child? How far do we want to go, and to what extent do the concerns and considerations of society as a whole carry weight or precedence here? Now, another set of problems concerning decision-making can be put in the following way. Do we want to take away some traditional individual liberties in medicine and health to achieve socially desirable goals? The right to procreate without interference from the state has become a well-cherished right. But in the light of a desperate population problem, should some of those individual rights be limited? We have cherished the notion that the individual's body may not be invaded against his or her will. But what if we could gain the release of someone by prison? Gain the release of someone from prison by imposing upon that person unwanted psychotropic drugs or brain surgery. If the person would gain, and perhaps society gain as well, would that not be sufficient reason to go ahead with such procedures, even if the individual in question said that he or she did not want that to happen? A third very large set of problems concerning decision-making may be put in the following way. Since basic medical research can lead to such enormous powers for good or evil, should that basic research be subjected to public control? Our tradition to date, a tradition which one ought to recall was one with great difficulty, has said that the freedom of scientific research ought to be absolute. Put another way, that there ought to be no restraints ever exercised against the individual scientific researcher. But what if we see that certain types of basic research may well lead to great harm to the public? Should the public be consulted in those cases? And should the individual scientist perhaps be restricted if the public felt that the research is going to be harmful to its welfare? Which comes first, the welfare of the public or freedom of scientific inquiry? A very important principle in our society is that those who are likely to be harmed by the outcomes of the decisions of others ought to be consulted in those decisions. Is this to be the case with scientific inquiry? I think a particularly intriguing area for contemplation in this respect is that of human aging. There are many scientists now who are doing, or would like to do more of, if they could get the money, basic research in the process of human aging. But are we prepared really to give total blessing to this research, particularly when we have no idea really whether it would be good or bad for society to see the average lifespan extended to, say, 10, 20, 30, 50 years? Ironically, of course, we'll never find out whether it will be for good or evil unless the research goes forward. But of course, we may also find, or more likely our grandchildren will find, that we're sorry the research began in the first place. The fourth large problem area I would point to would be summed up in the following question. To what extent should professional standards and norms be left to the professions themselves? And to what extent should the public have a role in establishing the ethical standards for the professions? This, of course, is a very hotly debated point these days, in great part because the medical and scientific communities often resist and indeed resent attempts on the part of the public to lay down standards to be applied within the professions. It is often argued that the general public cannot understand the difficult scientific or medical issues at stake, that in any case, the scientific and medical professions, being composed of honorable human beings, can take care of their own ethical and value dilemmas. Now, I suppose there's a great deal of merit to that argument. For both in medicine and science more broadly, there has been a tradition of ethics, indeed a tradition of virtue, which few other professions historically have been able to approach. And yet at the same time, it has also been well recognized that no group ought to be left entirely to be its own judge. It is not necessarily that any one professional group is worse than any other group, but that the possibility of self-interest makes it imperative that others, namely outsiders, also take a look at what is going on within professions and have some say about it. Moreover, it is an important insight of our time that what goes on within the medical and scientific professions can have enormous ramifications for the whole of human society. And as mentioned earlier, if the implications of the work and standards of a profession will affect others, then those others, in this case us, namely the general public, should have some say in what happens to them. Now, by and large, I've stressed merely questions, only hinting here and there at possible answers. Certainly our society as a whole has no solutions to these questions. One finds heated debate and difference on practically every problem I have raised in this talk. Many of us as individuals can probably come to some solutions, at least ones which, if we can't thoroughly defend, we are prepared to live with. By and large, however, it seems to me that one ought to be basically muddled and troubled by these problems, and to recognize that even if we can come to some private solution, that our private solution is not necessarily the best solution for others or for the society at large. And if there's any one point which I think is critical, it is precisely that the problems are, by and large, societal rather than individual. I think the enormous tendency and pressure in our society is to wish that we could all find private solutions to large questions. I don't think in the case of medicine and biology, precisely because they so project us into the future, they so project us into making decisions which are going to affect not really just our lives, but even more decisively the lives of others, that somehow we need something better than our own untutored private judgment. In this respect, I think that we need, in a very fundamental way, a social ethic. And by that I mean an ethic which does command some social consensus, which does rest on principles with which many can share, which does allow us to solve issues without always taking them to courts and legislatures. I'd like to end by saying a bit about the Karen Ann Quinlan case. Here, I think, is a beautiful example of the problems medical technology is throwing before us. Here is a girl who is not dead by any legal criterion of death, who is being disputed over by physicians, by the parents, by a publicly appointed guardian. A situation in which all of the parties concerned with the case seem to have very different issues, very different positions, and very different value systems. That case was taken to a court in New Jersey. A judge handed down a decision which in effect said, I can't solve this problem, I will leave it to the medical profession. That, I would want to argue, was no solution whatever. The problem is not whether judges should handle these issues. The problem is essentially who is to decide in a case like that, and what is the issue to be decided. There seems to me no reason on the face of it to say that it is a medical judgment. The physicians, so far as I know, have no special training or competence in making moral decisions. They have training in using respirators and making predictions and projections about prognoses. They have training in prescribing treatment. They have no training in deciding whether respirators should be turned on or off, simply because they have no training in deciding who should live and who should die. By the same token, I would say neither do parents, neither do we as members of society have any sort of wisdom. But it seems to me evident that we have, by one means or another, to come up with such wisdom. If Karen Ann Quinlan had ended up in one hospital rather than another hospital, she might well now be dead, simply because the physicians there, using their, quote, medical judgment, would have decided that the respirator should have been turned off. Also, had Karen Ann Quinlan perhaps had another set of parents, she might have had a set of parents who said the respirator should not have been turned off. I like to speculate about the possibility that what if the situation had totally been otherwise than it was, a perfectly plausible scenario in our society, namely that the parents wanted her kept alive and the physicians wanted the machine turned off. What would the judge have said in that case? That could well have happened had she had other parents and had they dealt with other physicians. This leaves us, I think, in a fundamentally confused state. We don't know how to deal with these issues. We don't know what is genuinely in the benefit of individuals. We don't know how society ought to work through these problems. The best I can do at the moment is offer some suggestion of what the nature of the problems are. I think the first step is not to come forward with their own private opinions, though of course it's irresistible to do so, but to see if we can, as individuals in society, decide how to sort the problems out. We are not in a situation where people have been talking for many years and the time has come for action. I think there is indeed too much of a tendency toward action in these issues and too little a tendency to do some thinking. And if I would promote anything with these issues, I would say think, stop acting for a while, and see where we go. I think that will be profitable, and in any case, I don't know anything else more profitable. Thank you. I will take some questions. Yes.
What is some questionable experiments having to do with genetics, controversial experiments?
Well, I'll mention two. Certainly experiments, one on a process called cloning, which is an attempt to see if one can develop identical human beings, genetically identical, replicable human beings. The question there is, ought we to go forward with experiments of that kind, enabling some people, say, to decide that they will reproduce one given individual in X large quantity? I mean, do we have the right to do that kind of thing? Do we have the right to reproduce people according to our desire that they be genetically identical to some idea which we might set? A second and perhaps even more immediate issue is that it's now becoming possible to perhaps by the introduction of one gene from one human being into the genetic composition of another human being to make some basic differences in that second human being. The problem is, with that particular form of research, it may be well possible to cure some genetic diseases. Indeed, it may be well possible to make some fundamental advance toward a cure for cancer. At the same time, there apparently is a real theoretical hazard that what one will do is introduce cancer into the community at large in a willy-nilly, rapid, and very dangerous fashion. That's almost a beautiful case where the scientific possibilities of doing good are very great, but the hazards of doing harm are also equally great. Now, how does one handle a problem like that? And who makes the decision concerning it? Sex selection, I think, is a more trivial example. Since I take it that a real power on the part of couples to choose the sex of their children would undoubtedly have enormous social consequences. It would surely change the distribution of the sex ratio of male and females in society, a rather interesting, significant social experiment. Would this be good or bad? Most of the evidence suggests from surveys and other data at this point that most people would probably choose to have a son as the first child. And they might or might not choose to have a daughter for the second child. At least one could hypothesize or imagine a situation where would be, if this became simply and readily available, a great maldistribution of the number of males and females in society. I mean, is that the kind of social experiment we would lightly want to enter into? So there are lots I could keep going on. Yes.
I have two questions. One is, who can be made responsible for that million people in New York City deceased with venereal diseases since the pill? And the second question is, can the doctor just use the pacemakers on 80 and 90-year-old people a few days before they die of natural death?
Okay, and your first question, who can we make responsible for venereal disease because of the pill? Well, I don't really know the data as to what extent people using the pill have venereal disease. So, but let me, in which I don't know that that's really the case. That the
I want to say more exactly.
that the
You cannot just say this will safety valve.
Right.
And I accuse the medical society for our million, people.
Well, I don't think it's fair to accuse the medical society or even going back to people who developed, I mean, the scientific researchers developed the pill. I mean, the question is, can one hold one group responsible for a whole range of issues which they probably could not have foreseen? I don't think the medical community or the researchers, people distributing the pills could, even assuming you're right, and I'm not sure you are factual, even if assuming you're right, okay, let's say the pill has something to do with the increase of venereal disease. I don't see how anybody could have predicted that, or in any case, even if they could have predicted it, what they could have done about it. I mean, what does a medical researcher know about educating people about venereal disease? It seems to me that's an awfully heavy burden to lay on somebody. And in any case, when they did it, they didn't know that was going to be the result, because there had been no past human precedent or history which would have led to, that kind of a possibility. I'm sorry, now I've forgotten your second question was.
The pacemaker being.
Well, okay, all right, right.
But how far can the family decide?
Okay,
90 years.
right. Well,
This case happened in the future.
yeah, oh, sure, right. Let me make a distinction here and say, first of all, and I'll get into a complicated problem. First of all, if somebody is 85 years old, they are incompetent legally, they have the money, and they say, I want this, and there's a doctor available to do it, would there be any objection? I think most people would say no. Then we can make the problem slightly more complicated. What if the person is competent, they don't have the money, but their children have the money? Ought they to put up the money? Thirdly, to make it even more complicated, let's say that they want to call upon a national health insurance plan or upon a Medicare or Medicaid for that. Ought society to pay for pacemakers for 85-year-olds who will get a pacemaker and maybe live 2 years, as distinguished from providing basic nutrition to children? At that point, I think it gets enormously difficult. My own inclination would be to say that, as a simple way of deciding issues, overly simple, I'm sure, is that in the first case, there's no problem. If they have the money and they're physicians, all right. You certainly don't want to deny that to them. In the second case, I'm not sure that the children, say, would have an obligation to care for their parents to that extent. Although I must admit, psychologically, I think it'd be terribly difficult for them to say no either if they did, in fact, have that money. Thirdly, though, I'm not sure that society is obliged to provide that kind of medical assistance.
I think the family should have the say if they want to have a pacemaker or forget about pacemaker, because that's the case.
You would leave the decision to...
Leave the decision to the family.
Mm-hmm.
The oldest people that know the family.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, again, I'd make a distinction. If the family didn't want it simply because they were tired of that old person around, I would think that was a rather terrible family. If the family didn't want it because of the expense and difficulty, unfortunately, I think the family is in a terrible dilemma. I mean, we might agree theoretically. I'd be prepared to agree with you theoretically. I think it would be very difficult for some family to say, no, you can't have it, even though we know you're going to die, because we want to use the money for something else. That is a very difficult conversation to imagine in a family. I mean, the enormous guilt which people would probably feel in that circumstance. And here I would say you probably can't deal with that other than hoping that somehow, very broadly and generally, the people that old would not ask for that sort of thing. I think it's terribly difficult to say to the family in a very grandiose way, well, just say no. I mean, how are you going to do that? Yes. Sure.
I know that personal incidents of elderly people having their lives go on in various ways. One of them acted in the hospital in the summer. This man It was like, I think, sort of in the front end of an individual, he can only respond to those.
Right.
The answer was, I think, about 10 hours beyond that last treatment. And here's an example of a family, in this case, that family, not that family, they're not too knowledgeable, okay? And the young surgical team, the interns and the residents, had to make this decision. And they think of it in purely medical terms, in your book on page so-and-so, what is the procedure called for patients with this disease and this symptom? So it's called sending to the surgical team and spending 45 minutes working over this guy. Absolutely no effect. And I kept thinking to myself, no, let's go up saying goodbye, forget it. This was going on for days, and I was there every day watching. But it seems to me that it's too hard a decision for the family to say, let him go. Out of that man's life, I don't think I could say it. I don't think those people are the young people, because they were the attending churches. They're not allowed to say it either. There is no meeting of the mind, and there is no constant technique which you ought to give to the family. And you can't bring in the patient because he's not competent to make any judgments, or he's not conscious. And you have those two, the same maternity clinic. There are no discussions that are meaningful, there are no criteria. And we know there aren't, and we know there's some ethical things that are related to religion about you shouldn't take a life willfully, what you say. You can remove a machine that's willful, you're literally killing the person, if you want to use that interpretation.
Right. Well, I think. Well, I'd like to believe, I mean, maybe naively, that the problem here is really, at least at this general state of affairs in our society, that the problem is really more psychological than ethical, because I don't think in most of these cases that anybody would theoretically object to the notion that, look, there are times when treatment is useless, people should be allowed to die. And physicians will say that, families will say that, but in fact, they find it very difficult to carry this sort of thing out. I mean, the physicians, their notion of being cautious and thus a kind of good physician is to keep treating. I mean, the family might say, well, I think it'd probably be better in most cases to let people die, yet this is my mother, father, and I can't do it in this case. And that's why I see it as a well, right. Well, that's probably rather unusual that people would have that kind of strong feeling. They might feel it. What I'm trying to make a point is what I've been able to see. Many physicians, many families agree with the general principle. Yes, people should be allowed to die when there's no more hope for them, and the treatment is useless. When they get down to individual cases, then they have this enormous burden of guilt that they don't want to do wrong, which I think is a good impulse, naturally. Both. I mean, it can be either way. I mean, sometimes the doctors want to keep treating because they don't want to make that kind of decisive decision. The families will say keep treating because they don't want to feel, well, maybe I've been misled by economic desires, or I didn't like the person, so keep going. And here I think the problem is probably more educational and cultural than ethical, because nobody seems to argue very much about the ethical principles involved. I mean, that's my impression. How you change this, I think it's enormously difficult. I suspect the Karen Ann Quinlan case and others will probably lead people to change in the long run. But I don't think you can force physicians who've been trained to save life to keep going, to readily change their habits. And it's surely an awful thing to tell a family, or for a family even to say, yes, I know there's nothing in general wrong with this, but boy, for me to say, stop treating my mother is a very hard, mean kind of thing to do, even if they think that might be the right thing to do. That's the fair part. Yes?
I think you did a great job of outlining the questions and the issues. Is your institute also working on proposed solutions, ideas?
Yes, we are, right.
And
Yep.
are you coming close to some formulation of some proposals?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. And there are certain issues that I doubt that we'll ever agree on. Others where one begins to reach a kind of agreement on what would at least be good procedures, which doesn't always grapple with the ethical question, but still. We've dealt with the problem of psychosurgery, for instance, and there prepared some guidelines directed toward physicians, medical societies, associations of neurosurgeons, which tried to establish some conditions under which psychosurgery should be carried out. In the case of genetic screening, we really argued that there ought to be no mandatory genetic screening, that screening for genetic disease should remain voluntary, simply because there seem to be a lot of harms done by mandatory screening and the like. But even though that's the way we occasionally come at it, I think our main emphasis is on trying to see how one can somehow get these issues debated in some reasonably rational way, first of all, and more fundamentally finding how are you supposed to think through problems which are just brand new and unique. And that seems to us even harder than coming at with conclusions, because it's easy to say, well, this is what we like or don't like, and find a solution and propose it, but trying to figure out how you work through this sort of thing, that's hard. Yes?
It seems that mankind is used to finding answers, thinks that there's always an answer. Is it not possible that this is one area where there is no answer? That in fact, society, the medical profession, the legal profession, no one has the right answer?
Well, yeah, I think in one sense, yeah, that's probably true. When you say there's no answer, I think there are a couple of good reasons for saying there's no answer. A, there's no answer because it's hard to find somebody infinitely wise who will persuade us that that is really the answer. Secondly, everything keeps changing. I mean, it's not as if things stay in some static condition. I mean, the medical technology changes from year to year. By 3 years from now, we're likely to have some more refined techniques for detecting brain electrical activity in upper and lower brain, and being more precise about this. Respirators will get better. I mean, the problems don't stand still, so it's very hard coming up with the answer. I think, but I'd make a distinction. I'd say, in one sense, no, we never do find the answer. But in another sense, we kind of crudely do as a society. I mean, we do work at rough and ready solutions. We incline this way or that way. So societies don't remain totally ambivalent or agnostic. They cope in one fashion or other. I don't think anybody here, for instance, would be prepared to say that there is such a thing as the truth about abortion. But nonetheless, societies devise laws. They move one way for a while, they move another way, and they cope.
Clearly, no one man can have the answer to a life or death situation.
No, right.
If you accept that, and you allow society as being really the only other answer, then you haven't ended any point. Where society imposes its will upon.
Yeah, right. I think that's that's perfectly true.
People, whole groups of people, then that society don't go along with it. They're excluded from it, forced.
Well, I think you're pushing back to the point I mentioned in my lecture. I mean, do you leave these matters up to individual conscience, or do you put them in the hands of society, which may in fact impose solutions on people which are very bad solutions? And here I don't see any final working out of these issues. One muddles back and forth. I think perhaps the best one can do is not look for what is the truth or the best final solution, but sometimes very helpful, I think, to just concentrate on what are clearly the lousy solutions. I mean, throw out the bad things and say, well, we surely don't want to go that way. We surely don't want to go this way. When we try to make policy, what we have to do is at least avoid the obvious traps and the terrible disasters, and say, in between, we're left, kind of up to our own resources and a kind of general prudence about what will work, subject to revision by the next generation, changing of laws based on a kind of experience. I think the problem is, why ought we to expect to find a truth, but just because we can't find the truth is no reason to despair of at least working out something reasonable and workable for the time being until the medical situation change, which we can be very well sure it will change probably in 10 years. So, yes?
And there is absolutely no effort to convey what this pathetic vegetable looks like now. Those who have reported on it say it's a horror. And I think this is a subtle way. I don't know why the media is doing this, but I do know that there are certain groups pressuring. And maybe that's why one doesn't get a picture of what the reality is, rather than the appearance. Now, there's one more important thing, and I've heard many people involved in bioethics, and particularly theologians talk. The question of human compassion and how it can be defined and how it can be operated under various different conditions never seems to enter the picture. And I think that's another thing. And thinking of cloning, you yourself did not mention that it's an asexual form of reproduction, and that very much alters the whole social scene as far as women's until now, the significance that was attributed to women's role in life. What will happen to women is another question if cloning is going to take place. And as far as the issues in abortion, it strikes me, as I've been in on many of these debates in a participant level, that it is a curious thing that those against abortion refuse to take into account the fact that the unwelcome result of sexual involvement is produced by two, so it starts before it becomes an embryo. And then further, this is taking place within the body of a woman who has to go through great pain to deliver it, and whose life is unalterably affected by it, no matter what happens, and who may unfortunately, and inevitably does for my experience, have some very negative responses toward the child. So my point is not that there is any one decision or anyone, but that there are an awful lot of issues that somehow get swept under the rug. I don't quite understand why.
Well, okay, I mean, you've raised all kinds of issues. I assume when you talk about compassion, that you recognize that people have different notions of what's compassionate behavior. I mean, it's pretty clearly, I don't deny, I mean, I don't think you would, with that even knowing that, I don't think you'd be prepared to say those doctors who would not let Karen and Quinlan die must therefore be cold-hearted people who just are technocratic monsters. Yeah, you don't know. You'd say, well, they might be compassionate in their own way too. Or that somehow the parents are, by definition, clearly more compassionate. the fact of the way, the reality, Karen Ann Quinlan, if we really get down to compassion, we know she's not suffering. And thus, toward whom should our compassion be directed? Her, the family, the doctors? I don't know who's to be the object of compassion. But you have no reason to believe that she is suffering personally.
But I have something I want to call your attention.
Now,
Dr. Christian Bonner was on TV, and this question was put to him. And he had an excellent answer. I don't know how you feel about it, because he said, no person is forced to accept medical treatment. And where the person is competent, the family isn't forced to. Therefore, as far as he's concerned, we're considering the wrong end of the question, which is, why not someone or some family which does not want life extended when life is no longer anything but a vegetative state,
no.
continue? So that's another side of complicated question.
Well, I happen.
Very
Oh yeah, no, right. I happen to agree with you on that particular case. I'm trying to get at the notion of what's compassion and to what extent we ought to solve ethical problems by looking at. I mean, if you've been in the abortion debate, I mean, I for a long time have speculated that people seem to divide on the abortion thing by being dominated by quite different images. Physicians who had to clean up illegal abortions, that was their compassion was toward these women who were forced to get illegal abortions. There's another group of women, not all of them de facto crazy, who believe there's something to having a child, and that's a terribly important. That's their compassion, kind of. And if you want to look at the results, they say, well, by God, look at some fetuses cut up and thrown into pails. That's a reality too.
Talking about Dr. Callahan, I'm awfully sorry because I know there isn't time really to engage in
Yeah,
a meaningful
right.
debate about this. But I want to say that there are all, as a psychiatrist, I know there are all kinds of motivations.
Yeah.
And sometimes,
And all kinds of compassions.
well, I'm willing to agree, which is why
Right.
my point is we ought to define what compassion can be in various circumstances.
Yeah,
But
right.
getting back to this issue, very often people who have not been able to satisfy themselves in one way or another take great pleasure in seeing that another person goes through their misery too. And I think one of the things we have to try to sort out, and I think it's not impossible, but very difficult, is what the true motivations of people are who insist, for example, that someone like the poor Callahan should go on while it's constant torture to her parents, to say nothing, of course, of the issues of money, and it's not fair to accuse a parent of only having money as a source of concern. And it comes to the question of the lives of the really living, like their children. What are their children getting while they are tied up in this story? So I really say that I wish an organization like yours would give consideration to some of the subtler issues which nonetheless I think have to be looked at carefully rather than just say, well, we'll eliminate the obvious and then see what happens. I don't think that'll help.
Well, I think we do, but then we're accused of being abstract and too general. But anyway, yeah.
I question though, even though the parent or the family has the prerogative of saying we don't want this operation or we don't want further treatment, wouldn't they be subject to legal? Let's say one doctor is very, very uptight about them. Might not he bring them to court as having murdered the daughter? I mean, it's a matter of
and how many people are allowed to die. You see, we always pick on the thing that's under our nose. But there are children, and we've heard, of course, about battered children, but I think there are untold numbers of battered children who never get to medical attention and just die one way or the other. And we don't get that up right about that. So this shows how complicated it is.
I would say economically we get a lot more uptight about this. There's a lot more money going into research on battered children than there is on ethical issues any day. If you want to get down to a crude index of who cares the most about what, I think that's factually true.
Would you say that again?
That there is far more money going into research and work on battered children than there is on worrying about how we're to make decisions in the Callahan and Quinlan case or these other medical ethical issues.
They don't even teach this in half the law schools.
No, they really don't. But absolutely, no.
And no one teaches it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we're prepared to answer.
No. There are some courses around, but not many. Yes.
Getting back to one statement you made that when we consider the meaning of death,
Mm.
we also forced to consider the meaning of life.
Mm.
I was a little confused by that because I can understand the statement if you say, well, if we have to define death,
Mm.
then we have to define life. It seems to me if you just don't define death and life,
Mm.
then biologically it's rather easy to define that. Well, I'm a scientist and physician, so
Yeah.
I know the subtleties.
Right.
In terms of cessation of heartbeat,
Mm-hmm.
cessation of respiration, this is considered a time-honored sign of irreversible death.
Right.
When we come to the question, though, of the meaning of life, we're talking about something that's
Mm-hmm.
the meaning of a life that's a human life.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about someone who's in an irreversible coma or chronic vegetative state, we consider, well, what kind of life is this? Is this a human life? And people will say, well, obviously it's a human and they're alive, so it must be a human life. And though, as you said, and many people believe, and neurologists believe, that the type of limitation which is going on is rather limited to certain obvious reflexes, and yet we're treating this life, or whatever consciousness is left in this life, as worthy of all the rights that a human life has. And then on the other hand, I look at some of the ways we treat other organisms which have considerably more consciousness, and the way we rather casually experiment on them and slaughter them and so forth, who have far more consciousness than people who we care very much about as human beings and are giving them all these rights. And there seems to be some kind of a logical contradiction or rational contradiction if we're going to pay so much attention to something that we call a human life that has such a limited amount of consciousness, of sentience, and yet wantonly slaughter other forms of life which have considerably more and considerably more consciousness. I wondered how you...
Yeah, well, you're getting into something. I mean, we could spend the rest of the evening on that. Well, let me just say, I raised a question about when you talk about consciousness of animals, say. I mean, we know they have sentient, but whether they have consciousness, I think, is another matter. Well, that we don't know, and we're in no position to know.
Some animals with higher primates, rather high.
They seem to show lots of evidence of, what we'd say, well, that gets to look like consciousness. I'd agree. I think but I take the larger question you're raising here is, how do we come up with some sort of standards or criterion about these things, which somehow is not just capricious, which we seem to willy-nilly apply to people, and then even more willy-nilly apply in the case of animals, and we're not consistent. We do worry about a comatose patient with minimal brain activity, and yet can pour an enormous amount of resources in that situation, yet somehow very capriciously will kill animals for trivial reasons. Pardon? Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, and I don't know. I think, first of all, obviously there's a bias that we take human life to be more important than animal life, and human life, however problematic, is more important than animal life, however certain. And in that sense, we'll bend over. I don't think anybody would consider putting, we would think it probably the height of bizarre behavior to put our dying 13-year-old dog on a respirator, if there is such a thing. We wouldn't consider it bizarre. The Callahan Quinlan case, we don't consider whatever position one takes in that case, we don't consider any positions bizarre, that to say continue or discontinue. I think we might find it bizarre. Now, it's interesting, maybe your point would be to press, well, why would we find it so bizarre with that? Maybe but I think we probably still would. Which is not to deny your point, it's only to say we probably have not well thought this kind of thing through. And well, okay, that's what I mean. Old dogs, young dogs, or any dogs. It's all right, fine. Some individuals may do that. No one has yet proposed a kind of national health insurance act, although somebody told me interestingly, just as a funny story, which led to an interesting discussion, which I don't want to get into here, that a number of people on welfare in Canada made a legal claim of the right to own a pet, that the deprivation of a pet was a major deprivation in their life, and that Canadian welfare ought to pay the cost of keeping up a pet. Now, okay, I mean, you can argue about it, but how far ought that to go? Ought there be a national health insurance plan to keep animals alive? And anyway, I mean, I can't, that would be we could spend a whole evening, I think, fooling through. So I'm not giving you a good answer, but I can't, it's too big. Yes?
If there's decisions to be made, what do you think should be done in favor of the living rather than the one without dying?
I think the decision should be that if one can no longer do anything for the dying, and one will not do them any positive harm, then the decision should be in favor of the living. In short, I would say in the Callahan Quinlan case that she is not going to be harmed if that machine is turned off, because there is no further good anyone can do for her. That life in that state is life in some sense of the term, but it's hard to see in what sense one will harm her by taking her off that machine, further than she is already being harmed at present by her physical condition. Pardon? Well, the family's being harmed, but they're not arguing. I mean, it's nice. I mean, they're not making the case that it's bothering them. They're just saying it's doing nothing for her. I think if that family had said, said as their case that this is just too much of a psychological burden, I think we would have all felt a little uncomfortable with that, because they weren't paying for it, just that somehow it's bothersome to have this problem in their hands. They didn't say that. They just said, in thinking of her, this is doing her no good. I think it gets very complicated when you begin worrying about the burden on others, because then I think the way is open to a lot of dangers. And I've been struck as a very strong supporter of allowing people to die and so forth, having spent some time recently in nursing homes and having people report to me on the staff of it, who often themselves agree. They say, you can't believe how this movement is catching on. And we're getting calls from the family saying, now, if mother gets a little pneumonia, doctor, let her. I mean, they're jumping on a bandwagon because they're often paying for this care, and they love this new movement that's coming along that's going to get them off a hook. I'm not very comfortable about that kind of development. And sometimes the staff say, here we've got perfectly healthy people on our hands who are enjoying life and so forth, and the families are calling up, hoping that we'll allow some death with dignity. But they say, these people don't want to die. They're going to be alive for another 10 years. And so, I mean, that's the underside of all of this, which is worth worrying about. Right. Yes, yeah.
I'm still going to bring up the point about statistical morality. Society institute make these decisions, and it seems to me money to 200 other people who have the obtaining a vaccine or something.
Well, make your own case better by saying supporting these people who are not nearly in as good condition as the rest of us, rather than calling them vegetables. All right. And I think this is probably true, and that's the nasty side of the medical developments, namely that there are more and more expensive ways of keeping more and more people alive for longer and longer times. We can't possibly pay for all of the possibilities. And I think the hardest problem is going to be how are we to make some decisions here. And I, at this point, I really don't know. And I suppose we'll probably decide that people who are in certain conditions like Karen and Quinlan, that is not a very good investment. But it'll be a little trickier if she were a little better. I mean, you can imagine her not quite so bad. Maybe there's a 10% possibility she would recover. Then that would get pretty tough. No, that's right.
Are you a lawyer?
Well, you mentioned we've actually been involved in law school courses just around Columbia.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.